I'm approving for Kiara as well. Thank you, Kiara. So I'm here with two lovely, lovely colleagues, both former supervisors of mine, Dr. Van Bailey, Neijma Celestine-Donnor. Welcome to the conversation. This really is meant to be a very informal dialogue for us as we are facilitating healing after identity-based harm and bias. So maybe if we could start off before we jump into anything else, maybe some introductions. And I also wanted to ground us a bit in the land and the labor that we want to acknowledge, but beyond acknowledgments. But before that, Dr. Bailey, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit? Just share a bit of who you are. I know who you are, but the audience may not.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Van Bailey. I use they, them, theirs pronouns, currently located in Atlanta, Georgia. I am the project coordinator for the Trans Youth Emergency Project that's affiliated with Campaign for Southern Equality. Um, I have been, I have worked in higher education for a little over 20 years, including the BIS office, and also doing work specifically with queer and trans communities, being the founding director of two LGBTQ centers. So I'm just excited to be here and be in community with you all and excited for the conversation.
Nejma,
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I am Neijma Celestine-Donnor, and I am the Associate Dean of Equity, Inclusion, and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and I am situated in the School of Social Work. I began my career as a social worker, specifically as a trauma therapist, and really saw a lot of the inequities happening there, and decided to go to law school to kind of more look at systems and the way that we think about those things. And so I like to think that I am a lawyer that does social work. That's the best way to describe where I am. I also founded the Bias Incident Support Services Office at the University of Maryland. And I would say my work is really grounded in empathy and honesty, and really just a deep commitment to creating spaces of belonging.
thank you, Nejma. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. I, I'm BA Medina. My pronouns are Z here and here's. Now Director of Bias Incident Support Services at the University of Maryland College Park. I'm grateful, Nejma. Whether you would have said it or not, I would have said as founder, and then Dr. Bailey, and then I thereafter. This legacy that we continue to cultivate alongside the teams that are here now. Um, as I shared earlier, just the grounding of the work that we do. Nejma, you mentioned about the trauma lens that we occupy, all three of us. Empathy is at our core, but just recognizing that the land and labor that we occupy is not just about what has come before us, but also what is here and now. What the labor that we put in and others put into this work, particularly the pervasive anti-Blackness, we need to acknowledge that within this work, but beyond as well. And then also how it is that we take space alongside one another, assert space, but also hold space. What are your thoughts as we talk about land and labor acknowledgements? Anything that either of you want to share as you navigate the kind of Harriet or even beyond spectrum of this work?
Mhm.
Sure. I think one of the first things that comes to mind is Esther Armand's work in emotional justice. And she talks about statementism and the need for particularly organizations to move beyond statements, and to really do the work and the labor of being in relationship with one another to uncover whatever systems might be at play. And so when I think about that is what's happening when nobody's watching, right? And I oftentimes think about statements in terms of like, this is what we do to proclaim when people are watching. But for me, I'm always curious about what's happening in the background. What are those conversations around equity that really are grounded in relationships with one another, and how do we move, not just have the statements, but move in action, when it comes to what those statements might look like in terms of our lived experiences. And so, I think that's statements serve a purpose, but it's not the full purpose. And so that's, something that I definitely think about when I'm thinking about how we think about acknowledgments and statements and holding kind of these very controversial truths. But I'm also wondering what's happening in the background to ensure that what we're saying is actually happening.
Yeah, and I would say that I agree with everything that was said. I believe that, both land and labor acknowledgement statements, we can risk them becoming performative if we don't sort of follow up, as you were saying, with actionable things. And so I think one thing I always encourage folks to do is really ask, what are we doing beyond those acknowledgments? Um, and I think that could be a really good guiding questions into actually, translating into some actions. We can't be um sort of reading out labor acknowledgement statements when there's still pay inequity, when there's not fair labor practices happening in the very places that we work. And so I think the really important thing is that these acknowledgements are also tied to action, but also that those actions are spelled out, right? So like, as part of our commitment, this is what we will be doing. I think that's also really important, the accountability piece.
Thank you both. Naming the here and now, the accountability, the action steps, the relationships that are formed from this. I know all three of us have built deep connections with the places we occupy, with Indigenous folks, with Native tribes, as well as, the folks of color that do this work before us and currently, how do we support each other? So I appreciate you both naming the performative aspects that could be contrived from some of these statements. I'm interested, as more of an introduction beyond what you've shared as your names and kind of your backgrounds, how you really got into trauma and healing work, what really motivated you to do this work in the first place? Neijma, would you like to start us off for that?
Yeah. I'm just trying to think about my journey and sort of how I got here. So I kind of feel like before I got all my credentials, in many ways this was like always a part of of my being, in terms of thinking about things through a trauma informed lens, sort of unofficially. But I think my journey into this work, I think, has been shaped both by personal and professional experiences. Um, as a Black immigrant woman, I have had to navigate multiple identities that I think has really informed my understanding of bias, my understanding of what it means to both give and receive trauma informed care, but also what it looks like when that is not um present. And I think, growing up in a country that's really impacted by colonialism, I really saw ways in which all the systems of oppression kind of impacted individuals and community. And so I knew pretty early on in my life that I wanted to do something around that. And so I decided to do pre-law. Then I didn't really go to law school after that, but I became a social worker. Um, and I think that is, social work is really about doing trauma-informed work if you're doing it well. And so working with a lot of families that experienced identity-based trauma from the systems, I think was really eye-opening. And that was really rooted in a lot of racial, gender, a lot of things. And I think that was when I saw that we need both changes on the individual level as well as in the system. And then I think the system piece came for me going to law school because I really saw, while I had the individual piece down with my social work degree, I think like understanding the law and the systems and the structures um that perpetuate these harms and cause trauma um was really important. And I think I also have a very deep commitment to trauma-informed law, trauma-informed processes, protocols, regardless of where I'm working. And one more thing I will say, I was really surprised when I transitioned from working as a social worker into higher ed, the lack of conversation around trauma-informed practice. And I would be talking about things that for me I felt were really basic, that was transformative in the higher education space as far as having doing work through a through a trauma informed lens. And so I think higher ed is a really, to me, the perfect space to blend both kind of like that legal piece and the emotional trauma informed dimensions of bias and harm, and merge those two. And so that's sort of how I came in to the work, through those different avenues, but essentially always trauma being at the center.
Thank you, Neijma. Dan.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I entered this work through cultural center and identity-based support. So I was an assistant director working at the LGBTQ Resource Center in University of San Diego, and University of California, San Diego. And for me, I got hired during a time where there were lots of protests happening on campus, particularly in response to something that was called the Compton Cookout at the time, which was a racially motivated fraternity party that occurred, and then the campus got shut down for months in regards to the activism that was occurring on campus. And one of the things that I appreciated and learned so much from that experience was, one, um, the LGBTQ Resource Center, the Women's Center, and the Cross Cultural Center at the time did direct work with one another, and they invested in having a therapist move through their center and have office space there. And I found that so interesting because not every university does this, that there was an acknowledgement that they knew that they needed somebody who had a particularly cultural lens to be in the center during this heightened time, to ensure that students had access to therapy and mental health support. Now, one of the things that came out of that was also the need for staff and faculty to have those spaces, because we do not work in a bubble, and many of us were being deeply impacted by that as well. And so we really started thinking about, how do we cultivate healing circles that could involve different groups. And, for me, the investment that the university took in understanding that healing has to occur for students, faculty, and staff, and it is a practice rather than a one-time thing in response to something, I think is really critical. So instead of them just having, you know, which this is not necessarily a critique, but, oftentimes what I'll see at universities is something will happen, then we bring in caps, we bring in everybody, there's a response, and then it dissipates, right? And there's not this ongoing care that needs to occur, where, whether that might be because of resources or whatever, that particularly our most burdened and vulnerable students need. And so for me, I think being in that type of lived experience and practice really just became kind of a way of understanding of how to do this work. And I just carried that on to the other centers that I worked for and the other work that I did, because for me, unless you're talking about some level of emotional justice, as it relates to racial, gender justice, and other aspects of justice work, then we're really not trying to move the mark when it comes to dismantling systems that are harming us. So that's, really how I came to like understanding it. And then I felt like it was then my responsibility to continuously remind the university of the fact that we are always in if we are part of these institutions, there is trauma that is there, whether we acknowledge it or not. That's one thing, but there's always trauma present, and so it is our responsibility as a learning institution to provide the resources in order to support those who might be experiencing any type of institutional harm, as well as might be coming from legacies of harm. So.
Thank you so much, Van and Neijma. So much of what you shared resonates around the dynamics between clinical and macro when we talk about social work, the individual and the systems, the interrelationships therein, how laws continue to oppress, but also how individuals either respond to that trauma, right, Van? But also how you can be proactive, right, by having resources, having clinicians and available staff to be able to support folks. You're in some ways being proactive, knowing that there is trauma present in all of these spaces. How do you then lift up those that are needing that support even before they know it themselves? Neijma, as we're talking about this, and you mentioned this bit earlier about your law degree, congratulations. I know that's been a long time coming and recently achieved. I would love to hear a bit more about the tensions between legal, compliance, DEI, affinity spaces, how we might better understand identity-based trauma through these multiple perspectives. I also put in the chat for accessibility purposes for folks.
Yeah, I was like, that's a lot there.
I know, of course.
Okay, so I think there's definitely a delicate balance between the legal compliance and sort of DEI um, efforts, affinity spaces, especially when we think about affinity spaces as designed to share like folks who have common identities. So on the one hand, we have these legal frameworks, whether we're talking about Title IX, whether we're talking about anti-discrimination laws that are focused on preventing harm. But then we also have DEI initiatives and efforts that oftentimes push beyond this baseline of compliance, which is what the law does, right? The law is focused on you have these factors, you meet it, yes, no. And so that creates a bit of a tension. And you see this tension happen when legal frameworks, which are necessary, but they tend to focus on minimal standards, right? Whereas we have DEI work that really strives to be, or anti-racist work or anti-oppression work that really tries to be more transformative in terms of change. And so you have the purpose of the law and this legal compliance is really to ensure that people are not discriminated against. But it's not necessarily to ensure that people feel seen, heard, and valued. Those are two different things. And I think if you're depending on the law to feel seen, heard, and valued, then that's not going to happen, right? And so I think that's why we really need both, because the law really is how do we put measures in place to ensure that you're not discriminated against? The work of places like BIS, Bias Incident Support Services, DEI offices, is how do we create spaces where you can feel seen, heard, and valued? So I never really understood why general counsel and DEI offices didn't have a better relationship, because to me, it seems so complementary to each other. And the work and the work that we're doing. I think in general, to really better understand identity-based trauma, we have to be able to hold space for multiple truths. We have to. So, yes, we have folks that experience trauma within systems that are meant to protect them legally, but there are those who find empowerment and healing in those very same systems. And so I think that what I sometimes hear are people who say things like, the system is bad because it oppresses, or it wasn't designed to protect me, and that is true. And there are people who would say, and this very system is why, and I will say from my experience, I worked a lot with human trafficking victims. And it's that very system that allowed traffickers to be locked up, right? And so it can be both and. Like, we could both acknowledge the parts of it that needs to be dismantled while also seeing there are parts of it that can work for us. And we have to listen and honor all perspectives, I think, so that we could have sort of this meaningful change as we think about how all of these things work together with each other. And I think to be trauma informed also is about centering those who've been harmed and thinking about how we could use those systems collectively to help address the harm. What does it look like to use the legal system, knowing that that is not going to be a complete answer, but then we have DEI spaces to be able to do those things. And so what I really want to stress is the multiple truths part. And I think that's one of the reasons I went to law school, is that I wanted to understand how I can use the system for my benefit, how we can use the laws for our benefit and really make it work for us. Because I think there are stories that we are told about what laws are and what they aren't that are sometimes incomplete. And there are definitely more ways that we can be working together to address trauma, to address hate, to address bias. So that was a whole roundabout way, but hopefully I was able to kind of answer your question in terms of how I see all of those three pieces working together.
Always. Yes, you did. And your thoughtful ways of being able to center those harm, to be able to name the multiple truths, to be able to, indicate that transformation may involve those very folks that maybe we disagree with, but then can change the systems from within or even from the outside, right? It can be a coalition building, it can be collective, but not simply throw away a system that actually very well may, in the interim, still protect some people in the midst of it all.
Or people, or
Right.
not, don't throw away systems or don't throw away people. And I think,
Yeah.
for this, one more thing I will add, and then I'll shut up, about how these sort of three entities kind of work together, is that we also have to make room to understand that advocacy shows up in different ways for folks. And I think oftentimes in this work, my experience has been that in order for us to have change on the system level, in the legal space and DI, like, we have to be in the streets marching with signs. And I tell people, you are never going to see me in the street. That is not how I'm built. I'm just not going to be there. I'm not going to have a sign, because that's not where my skills most utilized. That is not where I am going to be most effective. I will be most effective behind the scene, writing a policy, strategizing. And there's no shame or judgment in folks, because we need everyone. And I think that's one of my kind of frustrations, where we have gotten to this spaces, either you're this or either you're that. Either you're in the DI space or you're in the legal space. And it's like, we create a lot of these tensions, but we all need each other, and we all should show up in the ways where we're most effective. So we're working together instead of folks telling people um, what advocacy should look like and what your own kind of movement building needs to look like. And I think that as someone who has approached it from both the social worker, trauma informed, and the legal, we need all of you all working in all of these spaces. So that's all I'll say.
For now, Neijma, and grateful, and obviously taking up that extra space to clarify and to really demonstrate the spectrum of options, right? That it's not an either or, that one does not invalidate the other, that in fact that collective approach is actually more powerful, is more transformative, because you're leaning into folks' skill sets, you're leaning to part systems, part groups, part individuals, allowing the whole to be able to be humanized more and more. So thank you, Neijma, for granting us in that. Then I know that we've talked a good amount about your departure from higher ed more recently, and now working for a nonprofit. But I'd invite you to share some reflections about how we might better prioritize human dignity and care outside of that higher education bubble.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because, you don't realize how much it is a bubble until you work outside of it. And right now I'm working and co-coordinating the Trans Youth Emergency Project, which is a national response to the healthcare bans that are impacting specifically transgender youth. We decided to move from the South solely to expand it nationally because what we were finding is that many of the laws and the way that they were functioning were very similar in other states. These states are typically red in terms of policy and their political navigation, and so we found that there was a lot of commonalities between the work that we were doing in the South, what was happening nationally. Now, one of the things that I realize is that what we don't do enough of, particularly in student affairs and DEI spaces, is really thinking about the national landscape and how it impacts our students, not only while they're here, but before they get here, right? And I am working with youth who some of them are about to be college age. And that trauma and experiences of them being denied healthcare, having to fly to different states, having to move to different states because of who they are does not go away just because they're at a college now. They still have to go home for breaks. They still have that residual trauma of what that meant for them, maybe just a year ago. And I think that there is a lack of effort and trial on higher education's part to be like sanctuary campuses for these students and these folks who are experiencing these healthcare bans, right? We have some partnerships with university hospitals, but I'm like, why aren't there more? And so, for me, I think that there needs to be this broadened expansion of conversation around how national laws impact us in terms of what trauma we're bringing into the workplace, how it influences our students on a day-to-day basis, what does it mean for their mental health, for them to potentially be born in a state or grew up in a state in which they can't be their full and authentic selves. We typically only ground ourselves in the fact that, okay, well, we're in Maryland, therefore things are okay. We have the quote unquote, we have progressive laws, we have this, we have that. And I'm like, yes, and we are also surrounded by states that do not. And our students do not live in bubbles, right? And we can't function in this way. And so for me, I think, the more that we can think about how these laws and policies that are being passed, right? Like the fact that Florida, it doesn't matter if you're a youth or not. If you are trans, you cannot get health care, right? And what does that mean for the conversations that we're having, particularly here, no matter where you're at in terms of a higher education institution? Because regardless, we are being impacted by these laws, right? We are being impacted by the fact that, there was a rollback on affirmative action. We are being impacted by the fact that there is a continuous attack on bodily autonomy and the intersections that happen with reproductive justice, right? These things do not go away just because you're on a college campus. And so I think that there's sometimes this false protection that, universities can feel like they have when it comes to the laws, and that's just not true. And so I think that that is important for us to continuously think about in terms of the national landscape, and to not remove ourselves from it just because we have good discrimination policies, or the fact that we might have whatever policies that might protect who we are in this instant, but we still have to go back to our homes and we still have to go back potentially to go visit our family members who are in these states. And so, I think it's really important for us to ground ourselves in a national reality about what's happening, and to remove ourselves out of a bubble, and patting ourselves on the back because things seem to be good here. And what I am seeing in terms of working in nonprofit work is it's not. We are all deeply impacted. And then lastly, I'll say is that there's still a lot to learn, particularly on higher education's part, from community organizing and the work that happens, particularly around when we're thinking about how to address harm, how to enact emotional justice, and other aspects of around how do we think about accountability, because people who are cultural workers and the folks who are doing community work have been doing this, right? And I understand that there's lots of limitations in higher education, particularly around because there are these policies that, we can't fully address and get to kind of the deepening that's necessary within our relationships, that I have seen happen in communities outside of higher education get to, and have tough conversations, that require a level of accountability that causes systems change, and not just individualized change. So.
Thank you so much, Van. Humbling, and I appreciate the broadening of the conversation into the more national landscape. The idea that we're ever safe is clearly not the case for any of the three of us and many beyond. And to think that laws somehow in another state won't affect us is just absolutely untrue. Not only is that on its face whenever we travel for friends, family, and what have you. But also, it is disingenuous to think that somehow we couldn't be there, or that some of our own measures are enough, and that somehow we are self-protected based on some of the measures that have been in place, and that others somehow are less human to care for because folks are outside of our state means that we should just not prioritize. No, indeed, we should reinvest and actually prioritize them because they are in spaces that may be less secure for them, their bodily autonomy and their health and well-being. So thank you, Van, for that. Another thing is I'm thinking about, Neijma, you, me, Van, as we talk through this work, is about the concept of psychological safety, right? We just mentioned safety being not just from a legal lens, but from also a physical and socio-political and emotional lens. How do we cultivate academic and work environments that prevent this kind of identity-based harm and respond effectively when harm does occur? I know, Van, you shared a little bit about that, some kind of proactive measures at UC San Diego. I don't know if you want to get us started with that piece as well.
Sure, and I won't take too much time because I think this is something that I'm continuously, thinking about, because I think that psychological safety is a challenge in higher education spaces, and I'm just going to acknowledge that. I think that one of the things that I appreciated about what Nejma shared was this, that there are so many multiple truths. And I think that that is the reality when it comes to accountability, that if when you're thinking about how harm occurs, one community is going to think about accountability in a very different way than maybe the legal space will, or how accountability might occur in another cultural community. And those things are really difficult to navigate in higher education spaces. And I think, particularly because there's this level of um, almost like professional intimacy that does not get addressed when harm is there, right? And so I think for me, I think affinity spaces are very critical. Somebody brought them up before because I think that in order for change to occur, people sometimes have to do work within their own privilege group. And that requires time. That's not going to occur over a semester, which I have sometimes seen where people are like, we're going to have this book club and we're going to talk about this thing and it's only going to last for a year and then we're done. That's just not the reality of what it means to really be in a space that is going to be trauma informed because it is continuous, right? It is ever evolving, and it requires constant work, and it requires people to be in a level of relationship with one another that there has to be deep truth telling. And sometimes I feel like higher education is just not there in terms of truth telling. And and because there might be certain consequences as it relates to that. So I think it's really important for, when we're thinking about preventative measures and how to get there, is how do we set up the best possible scenarios for deepening relationships from onboarding, right? What does it mean for us to actually talk about our identities in a way that moves away from this idea that we can't talk about, um, white supremacy, which I think is very important for us to have conversations about because everything is kind of grounded in it, right? And for us to move out of this responsiveness to link on to whatever trend is happening in terms of conversations in our intellectual community. And one of kind of the pieces that I'm thinking about is just like 2 years ago, we were talking about this idea of like white fragility and the need for us to address white fragility and all of these different things. That's not even a conversation anymore, right? And I think it's really important for us to think about what does it mean for us to leave these conversations behind and to potentially pick up new ones. Yes, new research comes out, new ways of understanding, but I need people to understand that none of this is trendy. It all has to be a process and it has to be continuous. And that's what makes the work hard and challenging, is that it can't be a one-time thing or even a semester-long thing. It has to be something that is really baked within uh, how you're thinking about almost like a student's life cycle or an employee's life cycle. And so that's something that I'm continuously thinking about. How do you deepen the relationships from the beginning, to ensure that there is a level of truth telling that allows for change to occur? Um, because truth telling really gets to the systems. Truth telling allows for us to have some shifts, um, in terms of responsiveness, and for us to also acknowledge boldly what our limitations are in higher education, right? I think that it's okay to talk about what we can and cannot do. And I think sometimes there is this aspirational aspect of like, we're going to do all the things and we end up burning our folks out or causing more harm when we're not honest about what limitations are there, right? We want to talk about anti-blackness, we want to talk about, maybe what's happening to trans folks, whatever, but there might be a lack of quote unquote policies to address that. That is a nuance that we have to have an honest conversation about, right? And that there are limitations, similar to what Nejma was talking about in terms of understanding that there are multiple truths that are occurring.
I mean, I could not agree more. And that is a conversation I'm constantly having around. So coming from social work, a lot of my roots is also in community organizing as well. And so working in communities. And as you said, Van, it looks very different. But we need to be clear about that from the get-go. Like we're only gonna get so far in higher ed. And on top of that, you're talking about a state institution that's higher ed. That adds another layer. And I'm very clear about that, but I think some people are not. And what they try to do is create uh change or take actions that are not going to be impactful in higher ed, maybe higher ed is not ready for, and that's okay, right? Like if you are at a place where you're like, this this is what I'm looking for. And you have to be clear about whether higher ed is or is not for you. But if you're going to be in this space, I think you have to acknowledge the limitations because you will burn out. And so I think one of the things that I'm always telling my staff and our students is like, this is higher ed. we're gonna get about this far. And we're gonna set realistic goals for where we are understanding what we can change and what we can control in this space. If you're looking for something more, like I'm happy to connect you to a community organization, and that's fine. And that does not mean that the work is less important. It doesn't mean that the work is less transformative. It doesn't mean that it's performative. It just means that you're working in a space where you acknowledge the limitations. So I really want to just uplift that point because I 100% agree. I think in terms of preventing harm, for me, one of the biggest things is well, two things. One of the things of what you said, Van, which is relationships. And so I am often surprised, when harm happens and people come and they're like, I want to fix this thing. And my question is often, what are you fixing? What are you repairing? There is no relationship to repair because you haven't invested the time and energy it takes to create the relationship and to community build. So now you want to repair something that does not exist, right? Um, and the worst time to try to build a relationship is during harm or conflict. Like, why would someone want to build a relationship with you when you've just violated their trust? And so 100% working on relationship building. But I do think it's very hard, particularly for people that are in academia and higher ed, to appreciate the process. They want outcomes, and so they can't see the process of relationship building. It's like, when are we gonna get there? When are we gonna get there? But the process is so important so that when harm does happen, the foundation is there, that you can always activate the relationship, and there is trust and there is investment in wanting to repair it. I think the second thing in terms of sort of creating psychological safety and addressing harm is education, because I think it's really important that everyone understands the impact of microaggressions, the impact of biases, the impact of systemic inequalities. I know that for a very long time when I would have conversations with people, they would say things like, well, that person was offended. And I would have to explain, it's not just being offended, right? That's one thing, but we're really talking about trauma here and really educating them and giving them language. I think also when the harm happens, from my perspective, it has to be really restorative. And what that means is that we have to center the people who have been harmed. I would say that over and over and over and over, because what we often do is censor the people who have caused the harm. And we censor them by spending a lot of time, energy, and resources in figuring out what we could do to them. Meanwhile, while we're focusing on going after the people who have caused the harm, the people who have actually been harmed are sort of there like, okay, wait, what about me? And I say that as I mentioned before, I worked with a lot of victims of human trafficking, and so much resources, not that I'm comparing a trafficker to this, but I'm just saying so much resources was often put in like catching the trafficker and getting them and jailing them. And meanwhile, there were so many needs for the victims, and we were not paying attention. And that is sort of the same thing that I think tends to translate when we're talking about this. And related to that, we were talking about accountability and accountability structures and what that looks like. And this, we may or may not agree on this point to both of you, but for me, I think that we often conflate accountability with punishment. So when people say, I want accountability, what they're actually asking for is punishment. And for me, I don't know that punishment leads to change in behavior. I think accountability does. And I think accountability does not have to mean somebody gets suspended, somebody gets locked up, somebody gets. Now, there's a place for punishment, to be clear. But oftentimes, I think, particularly with some of our students, some of our faculty and staff, they're asking for accountability, and what they really want is punishment. And I don't believe that, particularly in a higher ed setting, for the most part, now there are things that you have to be punished, but for the most part, punishment is the answer. I think accountability is, because again, um, we could punish someone by expelling them, and they're just going to go to another university and do the same thing because there was no accountability, because there was no sort of learning and unlearning about their behaviors. And so I think that is a big part of how we, on a larger, broader scale, address harm and try to think about it not happening again, by engaging in true accountability, by helping people understand. Now, again, this is not going to work for everybody. Some people are just not going to get it. But when we think about helping people to learn and unlearn and undo so that they don't do it again, that is preventing the harm from happening again. If I fire Professor X without that accountability, Professor X is going to go to University A and do the same thing. So have I really prevented harm? Maybe from this institution, but not generally happening. And so I think if we could have more conversations about, let us not conflate accountability with punishment, and let's really truly understand the differences, that will go a long way, I think, in helping to prevent and address some harm, and ultimately addressing some of that psychological safety.
Thank you so much, Neijma. I mean, you basically answered the next question. I'll still put it out there about really centering those who are harmed. What restorative practices really does is negates the white supremacist view that punishment really is the goal, that it really is not about repairing the harm that folks experience. How much more powerful and yet more time consuming, more energy to center those folks, give them agency and choice, align them with the process in the way that they seek after what does repair look like for them, rather than say only this method of removing somebody from an institution is going to work well, when it very much could exacerbate harm. They could double down and make it even more harmful over time. And you're not really caring for and attending to the needs of that person or that group who's experienced that. So thank you, Neijma, for grounding us basically in restorative practices, how we do that.
Yeah, and I do think, well, are you going to ask the question? Or are we going to?
But however you want to go.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to
Jump in.
add on to that, because you did a beautiful job of, I think, outlining restorative practices. So I want to add to what it is. But what I would say is, restorative practices should also be accompanied by systemic change. It should also be accompanied by other things. So for me, whenever we're doing restorative practices, I'm thinking, what are the policy reforms that should go along with this? What are the structural changes that I need to be thinking about during this restorative process? What is the ongoing education that is needed? I think it's not either or. So we're not saying like, okay, we're doing this restorative kumbaya, as some people call it in my institution. No, we're doing both. We're also recognizing that there's some structural changes that need to take place as well. So it goes hand in hand, is the only thing that I would add to your explanation.
Thank you, Neijma. Go ahead, Van. Go ahead. Jump in.
Yeah, and I one of the things that, I really appreciate this conversation, and what keeps coming up is the need for the relationships, right? And I think when Najma was talking about this idea of punishment versus accountability, one is asking, it's probably going to require someone to, in terms of punishment, abandon the relationship and not have to actually sit down, potentially, if that's what the person who has been harmed wants, to actually be faced and have a conversation about what that harm has done for them, and not just hear the consequences of that behavior, but to actually understand how that's been impactful for someone. I also think that it's really important to understand that accountability is a love language, right? And it requires people to be in deep community with one another, and to know that it is only for the betterment of that, not just the relationship, but those two individuals. I think lastly, when we're thinking about how we might really think about restorative practices, is really not abandoning our relationship to that system of oppression, right? Sometimes people want to have a conversation and understand kind of individualistically what I can do, but they're not trying to negotiate and understand what their maybe historical legacy and current reality is with that system of oppression, right? So if I am a, cis person, for instance, and I need to understand what my relationship is to the system of cissexism and understand the legacy of transphobia and whatnot. If I am a white person, what is my relationship to the culture of whiteness and how I came to understand whiteness? Things like that that are really important to dig up internally and understand how to make those shifts. Because if not, then that can also repeat a cycle, depending upon what situation you're in. So understanding, yes, how to address the harm is important in terms of what that person might need and want in terms of accountability and restoration, but not separating yourself from the actual culture in which that harm or legacy might be coming from, I think is very critical as well.
Very well said. And even looping back to something shared earlier about how affinity spaces, Van, you shared how that can be a place of care as well as accountability, that folks may need to kind of unpack all of these different isms, these different harms that they've experienced, but also have harmed others, how to really unpack that in a space where they can feel that that relationship is intimate enough where they can ask and interrogate a bit better than they would perhaps in a space where they can't ask those questions or don't feel capable. I see that we're closing up on time. I do want to make sure I honor that there was somebody who submitted a question in advance about what are the differences in how we support our own healing versus others healing, especially when we don't share the same identities. Who would like to take that to start us off?
I'll start off because I'll be really quick with it. I think for me, my learning process has been that I am not looking for that healing to happen within the institution. I am accountable to my own healing. That has required me to get a therapist. That has required me, to get emotional support within affinity spaces. And not really looking for that particular relationship maybe to provide me all of the healing that needs to occur. Right. So I think that there is individual responsibility to not always look or lean on restorative practices for that, but to also do our own individualized work and find what communities can support us when we might need some extra truth telling or some extra grounding. So that's what I have personally done. Is to really find my own kind of modalities towards healing that are not necessarily just grounded within the institution, but what I can do and pull from maybe other communities, my own community, go like I said, going to therapy, working out, doing all the things that might be helpful for me. Because if I only looked solely to that relationship, I likely will be disappointed and not get what I need, which I think is really important as well.
And so in terms of how we support our healing versus others, not sharing the same, I think for me, if I don't share the same identity with someone, I always really just try to be fully present when they share their story and not really offer any solutions or any judgment. I think that even when I don't share their identity or may not even understand their experience, I can still acknowledge the harm that they've experienced and acknowledge that it is real. Because I do think that acknowledgement of harm can provide a sense of solidarity and connection, even if we're we don't share the same identities. I'm also kind of always kind of learning about my own identity, how it intersects with other identities, so I can be more informed and be more compassionate. Um, and I think the biggest thing is, for me, I always try to ask what support looks like for them, right? In their space, what works for them. And going from there. I think in terms of my own my own healing, I am with Van, in terms of supporting my own healing. I don't look for others. I kind of see it as my own responsibility, for the same reason as, not wanting to be disappointed, um and and taking some agency and ownership and accountability for myself, because I do think there are ways in which we can easily say no one is helping me, nobody's doing anything, but we are people. And we could do things, and we can, I think, which is different, like, if you don't have insurance and those kinds of things. That's not what I'm talking about. So I really try to take ownership of my own healing journey, and try to reach out in those spaces that I know will work for me, and stay away from those spaces that don't. And the number one thing is, I don't expect healing from these institutions. I just don't. And I think this goes back to Van, what we were saying about being very clear and realistic with what we're working with, right? This is what we're working with. This is the place that some of us have chosen, right? To be here. And so, it's like sometimes I'm like, I hate capitalism, and we live in a capitalistic society. So it is what it is, and it ain't what it ain't, right? And with that, that's all I got for you.
Thank you, Neijma. I don't know how much I could follow off of that. Very much just to summarize a bit of what you both shared, that beyond there being multiple truths, there's also multiple journeys for healing. So it's not just a singular, this is the way to go. Everybody has their own needs, and be able to name those needs and limitations, not expecting that the institutions will favor us. I know, Van, you and I, a couple of years ago, did a whole session about healing justice. Promotion for that one another day. But to talk about how within systems, not expecting the same level of care that we may have for ourselves, or amongst peers, community of care that we decide. With our last minute or two, would either of you like to share any final thoughts, recommendations, kind of passing goodbyes, anything that you'd like to share for the audience?
I just really appreciate the space, and I am, as we are in the throes of an intense election cycle, I am wishing everybody lots of care, and wanting folks, regardless of where your political affiliations are, to be reminded to take care of yourselves, and to take care of each other, and to know that the there's always room for everybody. And the idea of scarcity is really grounded in white supremacy, and we want to dismantle that as much as possible. So let's try to do our best to make more room for folks to be able to thrive. So, but thank y'all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, one and all. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you both, Neijma and Van. You're amazing as always. Grateful for the conversation.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.